And hello, thank you so much for joining us today. My first question, you wrote books about Cold War and Gulag, and now about Holodomor. Why this topic for you?
I felt that the Holodomor was an unfinished subject in that, certainly in English, and I felt there was still room for a book that could really just tell the whole story from the beginning to the end.
Let me then ask, there are books that we know in Western scholarship, like by Robert Conquest or Timothy Snyder or Andrea Graziosi. In which way your book is different or new?
So I used the research done by all three of those authors and other authors, and particularly Ukrainian authors. Um, but in each one of those cases, so Bob Conquest was writing before there were archives. Tim Snyder has been mostly trying to tell a much broader story about the history of the region in the 1930s and 1940s. And Andrea Graziosi's work had been mostly concentrated in smaller historical monographs. And what I did was to combine all of the archival work that's been done with all of the memoirs and all of the oral history that's now available. So I used these many, many books, these accumulated oral history collections that have been collected by the Ukrainian government over the last couple of decades. To put together a story that told the famine, not just from the historian's point of view and not just from a political point of view, but also from the point of view of people who lived in it and lived through it. I actually looked for memoirs from all sides and as much testimony as I could find from different kinds of people in order to tell the whole story. I think the other thing about my book that's maybe different from some previous books is that as I was working on the story of 1932 and 1933, I pretty quickly realized that I needed to go back farther. And the book actually starts in 1917. And it starts with the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917, and it explains why that revolution and the civil war that followed were so important in shaping Stalin's thinking about Ukraine a decade later.
Can we say that your book is also a kind of an attempt to translate this oral history collected by mostly Ukrainian authors to the West, to international audience?
Yes, I mean that's a large part of what I was doing. I mean, you in Ukraine know most of this story. Either you know it from school, but many of you know it from your parents. You know it from your grandparents. You've heard stories passed down in your families. But people in the West don't know those stories, and you would be surprised how many people actually find the Ukrainian famine to be a brand new subject. They haven't heard of it before. They knew nothing about it. And being able to, the value of being able to transmit the famine, the stories, of ordinary people, being able to explain those to a Western audience, I think is, you can't even measure it. It changes the way people read a book.
You try to draw a broader history coming to 1917, for example, and to connect Holodomor to Ukrainization and then repressions against Ukrainization. For you, Stalin's war on Ukraine, on Ukrainian peasants, were a war mostly because they were Ukrainian or because they were peasants?
But my argument about the famine is that, about the Ukrainian famine, is that Stalin caused a general famine and a crisis all across the Soviet Union after collectivization, by disrupting the agriculture system, by throwing people off their farms. If you like, that was a kind of war against the peasants. But then once that began in 1931 and 1932, it was almost as if he saw an opportunity to use that famine to focus it on Ukraine. His goal was not to destroy all Ukrainians, but his aim was to weaken Ukraine as a political entity, to make sure that there was no sovereign Ukraine, there was no Ukrainian national movement, that there was no, that the Ukrainians did not have an identity that was strong enough to challenge the Soviet Union.
And let me come to a topic which you also discuss at the end of the book. I mean, the topic of genocide. You're discussing all the history of the concept from Raphael Lemkin onwards. Do you think we can describe Holodomor as genocide? And do you think, if yes, do you think Ukraine and international community has to fight for its recognition as a genocide?
So, yes, I do believe it was a genocide. If you look at the way the term was defined originally by Lemkin and by others, there's no question that the famine fits into that category. In other words, that it was an attempt to destroy a definable group of people and to eliminate their culture and to erase, weaken them as a national entity, I think there's no question that it was a genocide. You may find that it's more difficult to have it recognized as a genocide legally. And this, I explain, is because the legal definition of genocide and the way the term has been interpreted in the international law was very heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was there. It was part of the United Nations in the 1940s when the Convention on Genocide was being discussed. And the Soviet Union was very insistent that it be defined in a very specific way, in a way that essentially implied that the only kind of genocide that could be legally recognized was more or less something that resembled the German Holocaust. So it's difficult to recognize internationally. And I don't know whether, it's a decision for Ukrainians to make. I don't know that it's the most important thing about the famine. I mean, one of the things I worry about the genocide debate is that it distracts from people understanding the real history of what happened.
Comparing Holodomor and Holocaust, I know that this is a very difficult thing to say, to compare, but do you think that there are similarities between the two, and if yes, what are the key differences?
In the most basic sense, they're similar in that they were both attempts by the state to kill people, and to kill people not because of something they'd done, not because they were even prisoners of war, but to kill them for who they were. So by definition, the state was trying to kill Ukrainian peasants because they were Ukrainian peasants. And that's similar to the German state wanting to kill Jews because they were Jews. And so, yes, at that level, they're similar. There are, of course, many differences. The Soviet state was not trying to kill all Ukrainians. And as my book explains, there were Ukrainians who were members of the activist brigades who carried out the famine.
Do you think that Holodomor is a very important element in understanding what now happens? I mean, the Russian aggression in the east, annexation of Crimea, etc. Do you think it should be a part of the narrative in which we try to explain what's happening now?
I mean, the one thing that does strike me as important is understanding what I was speaking about a moment ago, namely that the way in which Stalin saw Ukraine not just as a small problem, but as a kind of existential problem. Ukraine was a challenge to, was something that a challenge from Ukraine could upset the whole revolution. Ukraine was dangerous. And I think there's a way in which Putin, with his kind of KGB background and KGB understanding of the world, has a similar view of Ukraine. It's an internal problem for him. So when he saw, Ukrainians waving European flags on the Maidan in 2014 and shouting anti-corruption slogans and calling for rule of law, he saw that as a threat to himself. This was a threat to Russia, and not Russia as a country, but Russia meaning his regime, his oligarchic, autocratic dictatorship is threatened by that kind of language in Ukraine. And so his reaction to it, which in many ways was disastrous. I mean, the invasion of Crimea and of eastern Ukraine has been terrible for Russia. It's not good for the country. It led to this boycott and sanctions and a backlash. But the reason why he reacted that way is he's inherited some of that fear of Ukraine. That Ukraine is a problem, is not a minor problem. Ukraine is an existential problem for Russia. Ukraine can challenge Russia. Ukraine can undermine the Russian regime. And I think some of that Soviet thinking about Ukraine remains in the Russian elite today.
How do you see the environment? How do you see your audience? I mean, is there growing interest to Ukrainian dramatic, tragic history, meaning the Holodomor? And do you think that your book is just helping people interested to understand it?
So, a funny thing is when I started working on this book, Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine, and Ukraine was not an important story. And of course, since then, the Ukraine story has become much better known. And in a way, the reason why it's become better known is thanks primarily to the actions of Ukrainians. It was, as I said, it was the Maidan demonstration It was the language that young people in Ukraine were using. It was this desire for democracy. It was the amazing ability of Ukrainians to organize this, civic action that suddenly drew the world's attention to the country. I think my book, fortunately, will help that, and I hope will give people some of the background to help them understand what happens in contemporary Ukraine.